good evening, depending upon where in the world you're logging from. At IT for Change, we are very excited to be co-organizing this edition of the School of Feminist Economics, which is devoted to challenging the algorithm. That means it's about challenging the power of big tech and reclaiming the feminist vision of a transformative digital economy and society for all of us. And I thank the colleagues at Dawn, especially Flora Patinio, for this opportunity to share from our work at IT for Change some learnings that we have had over the years on what it means to understand and unpack the digital economy from a feminist political economy perspective. I will just take a moment to share my screen. So before I start, just a word or two about IT for Change. IT for Change is a Bangalore-based not-for-profit organization engaged in research, policy advocacy, and field practice at the intersections of digital technologies and social change. And our focus is on furthering gender justice, social justice, and development justice in the information society paradigm. Our organization was born at the time of the World Summit on the Information Society, the first ever global process that discussed what it means to create a people-centered digital economy and society. And then after that, over the past 20 years, we have been working on understanding the way the digital revolution and its trajectory has unfolded constantly with this compass in mind. So today, in this particular interaction, I would like to focus on what it means to understand the digital paradigm from the perspective of feminist political economy. So first of all, let us try to understand what we mean when we talk about the feminist political economy lens. Some of you may be already familiar with it, but to ensure that we are all on the same page, just a couple of words. So the feminist political economy lens is an analytical lens or approach that shines the torch on the material conditions that further gender inequality. So the spotlight of this framework is on two things. One, it examines how market relations shape domestic relations. In other words, how does the interplay between the sphere of production and that of social reproduction materialize in the institutional order of capitalism? Secondly, it also looks at, following from this, how gender equality is intersectional. It is constantly paying attention to the fact that we are all not equally unequal. Just look at the socialist cartoon from the early 1900s that I have reproduced on the right. So this actually shows you how class and race intersect with gender inequality, right? It's not as if all the women of the world are on one side. If you are a woman from the global south, if you are a woman from the working class, if you are a Black woman caught in slavery in the traditional or modern forms, the way in which you experience inequality and patriarchal oppression is different from if you are a woman occupying a position of privilege. And this is always very, very important to remember in the feminist political struggle. And this is the reason why this lens is extremely useful, because it doesn't do these very reductionist approaches to understanding and confronting gender inequality, and it's able to play out the complexity of the material world, and that is why we believe this lens is useful. So now let's zoom out a little bit and take a look at the digital paradigm, what we hear about it, and how the feminist political economy lens could be useful. So when we hear about the digital paradigm and what it means for women's empowerment and gender equality, we are constantly hearing this hype and this optimism about how, the sun is shining, everything is perfect, the digital economy is opening up a lot of empowering flexi work opportunities for women, and it is also opening up new pathways and STEM careers for girls, and the AI revolution is going to completely end global poverty and usher in numerous digital dividends. And it is actually going to enable the women of the global south to leapfrog into a completely new paradigm. We hear that in different forms over the decades. We heard about ICTs for development in the early 2000s. Then it was all about the internet revolution. Then it was about big data for gender equality. And now we are in the process of talking about AI for social good and gender equality. The names of the technologies have changed, but the evolution of digital data platform technologies and the AI revolution is continued to be kind of like imbricated in the arc of capitalism, which means that the hype remains what that is, just a hype. And it's not like really sure the evidence that is accruing is not pointing to the fact that this hype is actually going to become a reality. Actually, if we dig past it a bit, we see that the digital paradigm is ushering in a new phase of global inequality. In After the pandemic, there was all this talk about how the big tech stocks were falling. Finally, the big tech bubble has collapsed. Sanity will return in the finance market. But as of 2023, when we look at how the US stock market has recovered, we are back to the same problem where there is a big tech concentration in market capitalization. And you can see that big tech giants make up about 28% of the Standard and Poor 500 index's total value. So financial assets and financial capital continues to be disproportionately invested in the big tech business model. That has not like really changed after the pandemic. We also see the trend of wealth concentration among big tech owners continue. So, as this report from Avid observes, 7 of the 10 world's richest people, all white American men in 2023, are owners of big tech companies, and they have a combined net worth of over 1 trillion USD. And most obnoxiously, we saw just a couple of years before this about how even as the COVID-19 pandemic was destroying the world's economies, the personal wealth of the Silicon Valley czar Jeff Bezos increased by $40 billion. So that is the kind of inequality we are talking about. We also see that the last 2 decades, really, of big tech led digitalization, by which we mean the unique business model of the platform firm that is predicated on creating networks for foundational economic and social interactions, connecting users and locking them in with some essential platform services, and then proceeding to mine ceaselessly the behavioral data of these user interactions. And we also have to remember the interactions between users and their environment, like we see, for example, the case of like farmers' interactions with remote sensors, their farming practices where they are interacting with the environment, but this is also captured through agricultural platforms that are mining data points of farm practices, of soil health, of weather information, and so on. So in any case, whether it is social interactions or the interactions of individuals and communities with their environment in the platform firm model, all this data is ceaselessly extracted and mined and used to create intelligence capital, the analytical insights that can be used by the owners of the platform to then further their economic domination and end-to-end control of entire market ecosystems. Amazon and its business model is an exemplar of how a company that started out as an online bookstore today controls almost every particular facet of the entire sector of retail commerce. And this ceaseless drive for vertical integration, for horizontal integration of market capture end to end is what kind of like shapes the big tech business model in its like basic logic or economic like core economic propensity. There is an inbuilt tendency for economic monopoly and market concentration in this. So the last 2 decades where we have seen this particular business model go forward has been collineared with the concentration of economic power in the hands of a few, a falling share of returns for labor as compared to capital. The statistics actually show this. And finally, limited progress in reducing income inequality within and among countries. There is this very important report from the UN. It was like released on the occasion of UN 75, looking at inequality bridging the divide. So this report actually points out how, while it may be true that in the past 25 years, inequality between countries has been reduced as average incomes in developing countries are rising. However, the gap between countries remains wide. For example, average income in North America is 16 times higher than in sub-Saharan Africa. Income inequality within countries has become worse. Today, 71% of the world's population lives in countries where inequality has increased. This is a cause for concern. So progress towards addressing income inequality is really slowing down, despite this initial superficial statistics that makes us think how average incomes in developing countries are rising. And this is something to ponder for, because these 25 years are also the years when the digital revolution consolidated. Poverty also continues to remain gendered, as all of us know. And studies have shown that poverty disproportionately impacts women in the peak productive age range of 25 to 34 years. And of course, we don't need research to tell us this. Our common sense will tell us this, that in the poorest countries, which have the lowest gender equality attainments in terms of skills, education, employment, the data and AI revolution will simply bypass women. So let's go back to the first picture that we saw and look at the view through a feminist political economy lens. On the left, we see how the sun is shining. The story that is like of a bright and peppy digital economy is propped up by this entire mainstream policy discourse and everything, including most recently, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity, a digital economic cooperation framework in the Indo-Pacific region that is being negotiated and which is pushing for a gender upskilling initiative that exactly has this kind of techno-optimism for women's empowerment in mind. But if you zoom out a little bit, you see that we are in a world which is in the clutches of the data kraken. Think of the Grecian monster come back to haunt us. And it's a world where there is end-to-end control of value chains by big tech. Our networked web of connections has been taken over. There is ceaseless data accumulation, and monopoly capitalism is just consolidating. So certainly we are in a paradigm gone wrong. Here's some more evidence for those of you who are still not convinced, who still think that this is like too broad brushstroke. So I bring to you two specific instantiations from a feminist political economy standpoint of why this paradigm does not work for women. So the digital economy is actually perpetuating gendered labor hierarchies and undermining women's livelihood futures. All the evidence is pointing to that. let's first take the case of platform work where there's a constant hype by policymakers, especially of how flexible timings will enable women to not exit the job market and instead balance their household responsibilities and responsibilities like in terms of like earnings and income generation and everything in an optimal way. And women can have the best of both worlds. This is what platform work is usually sold as, how the flexi work is the answer to the double burden and the penalties women incur after wifedom and motherhood, or not being able to go into careers in the way they like. But the evidence now from all across the world, and I bring to you some evidence from India that we have recently generated as part of a forthcoming research on understanding the platform economy in India from a feminist social reproduction theory perspective. We see evidence everywhere about how a regime of flexploitation is what is getting consolidated in the platform economy. So when we interviewed women food delivery workers, we actually found this story where one of the women was in a formal job in a hospital, but she left that job and she actually took up the food delivery job because between her duties of caring for her children, her mother, and also taking care of the house, the formal job and its contractual terms did not work for her. And food delivery is what she had to do because this is the only way she could balance the double burdens. Now, we actually see that there are many women who have done this trade-off, but it doesn't pan out in this way because instead of flexibility, they find themselves caught in a regime of flexploitation where there is complete unpredictability of lifetime and work time rhythms, as the voice and the right shows us. Nancy, one of the colleagues of Padma, the earlier food delivery worker we interviewed, actually talks about how waiting times on the food delivery app are completely unpredictable. And in any case, because you cannot predict waiting time, delays mean that there is a cascading effect on life and work rhythms and so on and so forth. And what we cannot forget in all this is that the flexi work is actually flexploitation because there is no minimum wage earning guarantee. Workers are constantly in a state of precarization that we all know, and we don't need to go too much into that, I think, because the evidence on that is unquestionable. So this is what the platform cell of flexi work has amounted to, and the gendered, racialized, and casted labor hierarchies continue to persist everywhere. Now, we also look at how there is a problem where violence against women, workplace harassment, the lack of safety, these problems are getting consolidated as platform work arrangements mean that women are left defenseless and on their own. They are cast in the role of entrepreneurs towards whom the platform has no responsibility other than just like, doing demand supply matching in the labor marketplace. So Rita, one of the ride hailing workers in India we interviewed, she actually shared with us this very scary and frightening incident where as a Uber driver, one of the customers actually manhandled her because they were actually trying to rob her by booking a ride. And the safety button that Uber supposedly was like providing to every car to ensure that the driver workforce is protected, that was not really working. And she was completely defenseless. And this is a story we hear again and again of the workers left to fend for themselves. And I also wanted to mention that in all these anecdotes and stories I shared, the names of the workers have been pseudonymized, actually. Now, let's also look at women in traditional livelihoods and what platformization or the digital restructuring will would mean for them. Let's take the case of agriculture, which continues to be a major source of employment for women in Asia Pacific and Africa. We see that there is an ongoing digital restructuring of food value chains, where we know that most food chains are now part of an industrial food value chain mechanism, but this is going platform data and AI. For instance, Bayer has launched this new digital platform, Field View, to help in a precision agriculture and smart solution in many countries. And it uses the cloud services of Microsoft and Amazon to do this, to extract farm data and then use that to retain its market advantage. We also see Deere, the world's largest farm machinery company, employing more software engineers than mechanical engineers. When you're thinking of smart tractors and things like that, the business of the industrial food value chain, the business model is really changing and getting smartified and datafied, undoubtedly. We also see another development where blockchains are entering commodity future markets, and they are worsening the problem where farmers really don't know how to like kind of anticipate the markets, and the commodity futures are getting like, even more locked up in the hands of big capital. We also see that there are new entrants in the form of online grocery and food delivery platforms, and they are forming a last mile link in the food supply chain that was not there before. All these developments, where there is this ongoing marriage between big tech and big agri, we see that agricultural production is further dislocated from culturally specific local economies of reciprocity and recast into a disembedded, globalized underworld driven only by the logic of big capital. This impinges directly on women's traditional livelihoods in agriculture and micro retail in the global south. The ETC group has done a lot of work on this, as has Green. So I think we put the readings in your pack, and you can also check that out, a little bit later if you're interested in the deeper evidence on this. Now I come to the second part of the paradigm gone wrong, where actually we see that in the ongoing digital paradigm, there is a colonization of women's bodies and life worlds. So just about one and a half years ago at IT for Change, we did this study called Data Subjects in the Femtech Matrix. And it actually showed us how menstrual health histories and intimate sexual practices are being profiled for the market, channeling the trope of the quantified self. So nothing is outside capital, not even the most intimate, personal, and bodily histories. I bring to you two voices of our key informants, which will leave us with some food for thought. One of our key informants, Sofia Scasera, associated with the Transnational Institute, she actually pointed out how there is a new form of colonization that is ongoing in the menstrual app market, where apps have strict legal regimes to follow in Europe, for instance, where there is a personal data protection law and other things. But if they operate in markets without such stringent laws, then it's extractivism with no holds barred. And that is what is happening. So the world gets divided into some women with citizens' rights in the metropole, and others who are just data subjects on whom data extractivism can be practiced in most of the global south. So there's a new form of data colonialism. And she says this is exactly what's painted to Latin America many centuries ago. Data colonialism has to be understood exactly like that. It is something that is being practiced on our bodies, our visceral selves. It's also important to remember that in this particular debate about data about the intimate self and sexual practices, reducing the whole debate to the loss of one's sensitive personal data is somewhat reductionist, because that is not the full problem. When you look at the Menstru app business model, the apps are not interested in you personally. They are interested in aggregating as much data as possible so that they can group users into particular profiles to buy some products and use data in a very collective way for this profiling. So, what does that mean? That means that even if we have personally adopted the best privacy preserving practices, we should still be worried about the femtech business model because the data of others can result in decision making and outcomes which are very inimical and problematic to us, even if we have personally opted out, and vice versa. The data we choose to share can have rights violating outcomes for others. And as Mary Kotsik, technology developer of the alternative menstru app Drip, points out, considering this new type of like nexus between the corporate and the surveillance state that is emerging, are we comfortable if a menstru app company can predict the fertility rate of a city for the next year and things like that? What do we actually feel about that? And this is not dystopia because after the Dobbs judgment in the US, we have encountered instances where Facebook data, social media data about a woman who was trying to look up abortion services for her underage daughter, she was that data was actually shared with police and law enforcement agencies, and she was traced back. We are living in a world like this where bodily surveillance is increasing, and so the femtech business model should worry all of us and maybe even give us sleepless nights. That's what I would think. Now let's come to the point about the life worlds and what it means for building like feminist publics and new solidarities and new social relationalities. I think all of us, especially after the movie, The Social Media Dilemma, do not need any convincing about what is wrong with social media platforms and their business models. So here I would just like to talk about related aspects about how the platformized internet public sphere that is dominated by Silicon Valley platforms is actually co-opting feminist voices, solidarities, and struggles. And I have put for you some reflections from the feminist activist Nadine Moawad from Lebanon. And her reflections are providing deep food for thought, I think, because when we talk about social media and feminist liberation politics, we must interrogate critically what we are talking about. This is what Nadine says. The English speaking Western world dominates the internet through its imperial cultural hegemony, but also more practically through Silicon Valley. And some queer activists seem to believe that Western sexual rights campaigns will somehow trickle down into our post colonial communities and have a positive impact. They take hope in young millennials, digital narratives who have grown up more liberal minded, speaking a universal internet coolness language that has transgressed boundaries. But remember, our project for queer liberation is bound with the resistance of colonialism and capitalism. Theirs is not. The liberal agenda will have us believe that global corporations are on our side in protecting rights for LGBTs and diverse groups, like when Facebook initiated a rainbow profile photo filter or when Google created a rainbow doodle for the Sochi Olympics. This is an electronic continuation of the offline trend of banks and credit card companies sponsoring gay pride parades. So, who are we allying with in a feminist liberation politics? Who can we rely on to champion our agendas and tell our stories? This bears some thinking about. Like most feminist political economy deconstructions, I'm sure that at the end of this exercise, it seems as if everything is dark and gloomy. But I think this kind of disturbance or this kind of discomfort that a feminist political economy lens puts us in is a good start to actually starting to imagine, is another world possible and what that would be like. I think in the next two talks and the discussions in the series, we will all be exploring what it means and particularly talking about a vision of feminist digital justice. I shall not get to that today, but I'm just going to leave you with some initial thoughts where maybe you could all mull over on what you feel about it. Are these practical or not? And of course, this is just an initial set of thoughts, and you may have many more other strategies to talk and reflect about. So, this is what we were thinking. That it's very important to hold big tech accountable for their criminal business model. This business model of data extractivism and ceaseless data mining and profiling must be seen as a violation of human rights, and in particular women's human rights, including economic, social, and cultural rights. And this model cannot be allowed to continue. And we have to see what we can do at the international level for bringing transnational digital corporations to book. And it's important to remember that when we are talking about transnational digital corporations, it's not just companies like Facebook with their or Uber, which have like this very user directed face. We should also be thinking about alliances between big tech and big agriculture, ag tech platforms, for instance, and what it means for farmers' livelihood sovereignty. Those questions should also come up in this conversation. Secondly, speaking about the internet and the communications agora or the internet public sphere, it's important to completely break down surveillance capitalism and the state corporate nexus. Facebook, as it exists today, and that entire apparatus of metas related, like, digital products cannot be allowed to continue with this level of profiling. It is very dangerous and Orwellian, and we have to reclaim the internet and the free and open web before platformization took it over. And this must be done at any cost. And we need an urgent conversation and what it means to build feminist communication infrastructures, like many digital rights activists and feminist technologists have been talking about for years. We also need to overhaul the trade, IP, and global financing regime. How is it that our data, like let's say if you're thinking about an ag tech platform, farmers' data is extracted and then enclosed within IP protection and used to kind of like produce a corporatized intelligence that will lock farmers into dependency. How did we arrive at like this kind of world? We cannot like tolerate any global rule of law in the form of trade, IP, or financing that entrenches data colonialism and global inequality. Our struggle for women's rights, as Southern feminists have long realized, cannot come to fruition without rejecting the poisoned pie of neoliberal data capitalism. And this is very important. We also need a people sovereignty vision of data sovereignty, where we have to understand that when we talk about claiming data, we are talking about claiming knowledge about social relationality and socio-environmental interactions, the collective knowledge that belongs to all of us. And we must understand the limits of the contractarian individual personal data protection model. And I'm not going to be able to unpack that more in this particular like conversation, but I hope in the coming two panels and in other discussions we start thinking about what it means to think about data sovereignty in a collective and relational way, rather than in a narrow individual, possessive individualist way where you think of data as personal property. That's very important. Now, and finally, but last but not the least, it's important to conceptualize an alternative regenerative digital economy, by which we mean we need to look at how we can redraw the platform firm model for social and solidarity economy enterprises that operate with some consciousness about planetary boundaries and ecological limits. So, how can we stop data colonialism and rebuild a digital economy that is feminist? This might mean saying no to datafication in certain areas and talking about collective controls on datafication, preventing corporate enclosure of data. It needs a whole new imagination, and many types of like lessons have to be learned from traditional cooperative institutions, from indigenous groups, and from visions of the global south about alternative new international economic order. So let me stop here. It has been like wonderful to do this conversation starter. And I look forward to hearing from all of you about your thoughts, your views, whether you find a feminist political economy lens useful to kind of broach the issue of what's wrong with the digital, and look forward to many such more conversations. Thank you.